Hello again. So today we're talking about responsive web design again, but particularly we're talking about media queries. It's the core of any responsive website design project, and it's probably one of the most difficult things to get your head around when you first start looking at it. It can be quite confusing on how it all works. And I'm hoping today, fingers crossed, that I'm going to demystify media queries for you and just explain them to you in a little bit more of a simpler way. We're going to go through a couple of keynote slides first, then we're going to jump into the code and I'm going to show you how it all gets put together. So let's start with this. So what is responsive web design? Well, responsive web design is just an approach to building websites. It became popular when we started to realize that something as simple as liquid sites, so sites that expanded and contracted kind of infinitely, they went all the way down and all the way up. We realized that kind of wasn't enough of a solution. We needed something better. And responsive web design came around to try and solve that problem. A responsive website basically means the website adapts to the window that it's in. So when you make the window smaller or bigger, the website drags up and down. And there's basically three core components of responsive web design, and I'm talking about them in these videos. They're media queries, they're flexible images, and grids. This video is about the media queries stuff, but there's also a video about grids, and there's also a video about flexible images. Once you've got your head around those three things, they're pretty much the three core components you need to make a responsive website. So the whole web design industry has changed massively. We used to only design for one screen size because we believed, kind of rather foolishly, that people were only using one screen. And in the olden days, they kind of were only using one screen. If you think now we have to design for loads of different screen sizes, we have to change the way that we build websites and also design websites. We used to think the world was like this. We used to think that people only use one CRT monitor, and the resolution of that was usually 1024 by 768. If you're a little bit older than that, the resolution was 800 by 600 pixels. Now we've got ridiculous resolutions that go into the thousands, and things have changed massively. Now we look in something like this, even though these are old phones. In fact, right there, that is the first ever iPhone that got released. Wow. Over 10 years ago now, the first iPhone got released, and the first iPhone there was really the thing that kind of precipitated this whole thing happening. This is what changed the entire industry. So before I recorded this video, I went over to Google Analytics and I looked at one of our fairly popular websites, and I looked at how many different screen resolutions there were on that website. Basically, how many people were viewing it and what their screen resolutions were. I was shocked to discover that there was 220 different screen resolutions visiting that website. And not only that, this figure's even more shocking. There was 387 different, yes, that's different, mobile devices in only the last 7 days in the Google Analytics that I was looking at. That's 387 different mobile devices, and that is 220 different screen resolutions. Because of those two things, this is why the industry has changed so much, because we needed to figure out a solution to this problem. How do we target so many different devices, so many different screen sizes, operating systems and browsers? How do we do that in a sensible way? Well, actually, this idea, this concept isn't new. It's something that's been around for a long time, and it all started from a Listapart article from a chap called John Alsop, and I hope I'm saying his name right. Maybe it's Alsop, I'm not so sure. He wrote an article called A Tao of Web Design, and there's some select quotes here. I'm going to read them to you. The control which designers know in the print medium and often desire in the web medium is simply a function of the limitation of the printed page. We should embrace the fact that the web doesn't have the same constraints and design for this flexibility. But first, we must accept the ebb and flow of things. When John Alsop wrote this article in 2000, yes, this is nearly 20 years ago now, when he wrote this article, the web was a very different place. We thought there was only one screen resolution, as I said, and we treated the website as pretty much a printed page, because most of the people that were designing websites were actually print designers. It's where they started. There wasn't a formal web designer. There wasn't UX designers. There wasn't UI designers. None of that stuff existed back then, so we kind of just made do with what we had. Designing adaptable pages is designing accessible pages, and perhaps the great promise of the web, far from fulfilled as yet 20 years ago, is accessibility to information. I've edited this quote slightly because he put some other bits in it, but I think the most important bit about this is the reason why we use responsive web design. It is to make the accessibility to information. It's to make information as accessible as possible across as many different devices as possible. That is the power of responsive web design, and it's worth remembering that that's why we're using responsive web design. And then a couple of years later, in 2010, Ethan Marcotte, who is probably considered the god of responsive web design, came along and wrote another article that referenced a DAO of web design some 10 years before that. And this article, just called Responsive Web Design, was when the term got introduced. And he had this to say: we're designing for mice and keyboards, for handheld game controllers, for touch interfaces. In short, we're faced with a greater number of devices, input modes and browsers than ever before. And that's more true now than it was in 2010. In fact, now the desktop device, you know, the big PC and the tower and the monitor and things like that, that thing is dying. I think it was actually over 5 years ago now that the mobile and the tablet device overtook the desktop computer by a long shot, and now mobile and tablet devices are by far and away the most popular device that exists. So responsive web design is not only a desire, it is a necessity for modern web design. And then one more final quote. This is also from the same article, Responsive Web Design. He said this: fluid grids, flexible images and media queries are the three technical ingredients for responsive web design, but it also requires a different way of thinking. Rather than quarantining our content into disparate device-specific experiences, we can use media queries to progressively enhance our work within different viewing contexts. That's one of the cores of responsive web design. We're not making multiple different websites. All we're doing is making one website, and we're changing what it looks like for different devices. So we're going to level the playing field with responsive web design, and we're going to target things based on device width. And when it's done, it looks something like this. This is a website that we built a couple of years ago. It's for a local college that's near us in the UK. And this is the example of something that's just a typical website, really. But you'll see when I start to resize the website in a second that things start to move around. This is an example of a typical responsive web design project. This is what they tend to look like. So as I scroll up and down, you can see the design has completely changed on there. It doesn't look like it did previously. And then I'm just going to skip along this a little bit so you can just see how this next bit looks. So as the site starts to get expanded upwards, you'll see the design completely change again right there. So you see the school leavers section is completely changing as it goes up and down. And that's a big part of responsive web design. That is the whole point of using responsive web design. So in a simplistic format, this is what we're doing with responsive web design. We're targeting different screen sizes with our CSS, and maybe we'll target these three sizes to begin with. We might target 375 pixels, we might target 768 and 1024. These are three typical sizes that people might use when they're doing responsive web design for the first time, because they're based on a mobile device. Particularly, that's the thinnest width of a portrait iPhone, and then the middle one is a portrait iPad, and then the biggest one is a landscape iPad. So those three things are kind of typical sizes to start with responsive web design. They don't usually end up like that. They usually end up adding a lot more sizes to it, but it's a good place to start. So to do this, and to do all this fancy stuff, we're going to use media queries. This is kind of what media queries are. So media queries are just CSS rules that allow you to apply different stuff at different screen sizes that you specify. So for example, if you wanted your header to be 100% width after 768 pixels, you could use a media query to achieve it. So at the top of your file, you might have something like a header 50% width, and then lower down you'll target when it gets to 768 pixels, you make it 100% width. That's basically how responsive stuff works and how media queries work. There's two basic media queries, the min width and the max width, and I'm going to show you how both of them work. But before we get to those, there's just one more thing to mention. Mobile first is kind of a concept, an idea of how things work on responsive web design. It dictates that we should probably start by focusing on the mobile version of the website first before moving upwards into the other sizes. It's a concept that means that your basic styles inside your design should be for the mobile, for the thinnest screen, the default screen, and then you build upon those sizes by using media queries as you go along in your design. Considering your mobile devices first kind of make it a little bit easier to write your media queries and gives you less of a headache as you move along to other stuff. I think though we could probably talk about what a mobile device is as well, because when I say mobile first, what does mobile mean anyway these days? There's a lot of different devices out there, and mobile devices now are huge. The width of them are ridiculous. So what does a mobile device actually mean? Some mobile devices are now as big as tablet devices, so it's probably better for us, instead of saying mobile, although some people will still refer to it, we talk about small screen devices rather than mobile devices. I typically consider mobile devices or small screen devices as smaller than 700 pixels wide or something similar to that. The core of any responsive web design and the core of building any responsive website is this tag here, the viewport tag. If you forget this, nothing works properly in responsive web design. It'll probably work in your browser, so if you're testing things in Chrome, for example, it'll probably work there, but when you come to upload it to the internet and you look at it on your mobile, you realize it's not working. So don't forget this vital tag. It's probably one of the most important things in the world for responsive web design, so make sure you add this tag first. So let's start by talking about min width. Min width is used to declare new styles when a certain width is reached in your CSS. Now, min width are applied from a certain width and upwards, so they activate from a size that you specify upwards from that size. So if we take the 768 example again, if you was using min width in your CSS, you target it from 768 and then upwards from that. Min width is kind of mostly used for a mobile first methodology and a mindset, as I said earlier, because you'll start with your mobile sizes and then you'll build up a little bit bigger to 500 pixels, for example, and you'll apply min width there, and then you'll add another one for 768 and then another one for 1000 pixels, etc, etc. With min width, you're building up your sizes, and I think this is the best way to build a responsive website because it makes the most sense. So let's have a look at how some of this code might look. If we're actually writing this in our CSS, we start by typing @media. So media has existed in CSS forever nearly. It's been around for a really long time, and actually min widths have been around for a really long time too. It's just that nobody ever really used them. So we start by specifying media, and then in my example I've put min width 768. So that means anything that's inside this here, they're declared from 768 pixels and upwards, and I've just put two things in there. I've put a main content with a width of 50% and then a sidebar with a width of 50%, just as a simple example. And then below that, if I wanted to change that CSS at kind of a higher width, I've put 1024 pixels in this lower example, and then inside that I've targeted the exact same stuff again, because remember, CSS cascades, it goes from top to bottom. So if I can overwrite previous styles by writing them again lower down. So that's exactly what I did in this example. I targeted main content again, changed the width to 65%, and then I changed the sidebar width to 25%. So this CSS here, what this means is that when it gets to 768, the main content will be 50% width, and then when it gets to 1024 pixels wide, the main width of the main content will change to 65%. Max width works in a kind of a similar way to min width, but flipped. So max width works from 0 to a size that you specify. It means that you can declare styles before a certain width is reached, and they're applied up to a certain width. So with max width, you must build down your styles, and you've got to be careful with how you use it as well, because it can start to really mess up your CSS and mess up your responsive designs. So this is an example of how this might work. You declare it in exactly the same way, but you put max width instead of min width. So these styles that I've got inside here will work from 0 to 1024 pixels. So in the example I've got here, I've set width as 65%, and then I've set my sidebar width as 25%. And then the one below it, I've put max width 768. These styles will work from 768 pixels, and I've changed the widths to 50/50. You can also combine both media queries to kind of make much more advanced media queries, and this is where the power of media queries really start to come in. So if you want to target between two sizes, for example, like this example, you'd extend the thing that you put in there. So in this example, the CSS that I've got is targeted from 600 pixels to 1024 pixels. And inside there, I've just made the main content background red, and I've just made the sidebar 25%. And I think this is where the power of it starts to come in. This is what you probably want to do with your CSS, because it lets you target specific sizes and in between sizes. Really, in a real world, when you're building a responsive website, you'll these days probably be using a boilerplate like Bootstrap or something, and some of this stuff will already be written for you, or they've got really powerful SCSS includes in there where you won't have to write this kind of stuff, but it's useful to know how they work from the default, because actually I don't think they're that difficult to write. So let's look at an example of how this all gets put together. I've put together a blank project, so there's nothing in this for the time being. I'm going to open this up in a web browser. It's saying 404 not found because there's nothing in it, so let's start by making an index file. And by the way, when I first start a tutorial like this, I always like to start from scratch by making the files that you can see. The reason I do this is so you can see how things are working, you can see how I write HTML and CSS, and you kind of get used to seeing things being created on the fly as I'm doing them, so you can understand what's going on. So I'm just going to put some standard code in here like this. By the way, you'll note that in Atom, when I type HTML:5, it puts in the viewport already, so I don't need to worry about that. Let's give this a better title. RWD Media Queries Learn the Web. And I'm just for now, I'm just going to put two things in here. Oops, spelt media query wrong. And then I'm just going to put just some content in there too, just to test that it's working. So that's working. We've got all that up and working. And now I'm just going to add a CSS style sheet as well. And then I'm going to link this up in here so we can test that this is working, because we're starting from default with this. Yep, so let me just test that this is working by putting a reset in here. And by the way, there's much better, more advanced resets out there for this kind of thing. But I just want to keep it simple for this tutorial, because the purpose of this tutorial isn't to show you how resets work or go into detail on those kind of things. It's just to test that some of this stuff's working. So that works, that's great. And I'm just going to put some just some default styling in here so it looks just a touch nicer. I say nicer, it's not really going to look that much nicer, but it's just going to look a little bit better. So I'm just going to change the body so it looks, let's go with Helvetica. So it looks a bit more pretty. There we go. And then I'm going to resize some things. Put a margin bottom on there of 0.5 so things look a bit better. And then I'm just going to style the P up as well, because we're going to be using that in a minute. There we go. So I've styled that up, and at the minute this looks like any other website. It's not really a brilliant example of how media queries work. So I'm just going to add some divs into here as well, so you can see how these kind of things are going to work. First of all, I'm going to just add, I'm going to call this content, this div. And I'm going to put this in here along with a H2. And just put 3 in there like that. And then I'm going to make a sidebar div. With just some content in there as well. So at the minute I've got 2 divs in there. I've got a sidebar div and a content div, and they're kind of just looking flat because there's nothing in them. Let me get rid of that question mark, because that question mark's disturbing me in there. I'm just going to put a container around this too. So here I'm just making a basic typical website structure, just so you can see how this kind of thing might work, and it'll help me explain the next bit too in a second. So let's just make one more section here called layout. Put some widths on the container. We'll go for 1200 pixels. And we'll do margin 0 auto to center it into the middle of the page. There we go. And I've missed something. That wants to be in the container too, Craig. Let's put that in the... Actually, let's put that in there. Like that. So now we've got a container in there, and you'll see when I just resize this. So I'm just going to inspect the element. The minute none of this is doing anything as such. So I'm going to make these two things go next to each other. But remember, we're working mobile first. So at mobile size like this, I do want this to be underneath each other. But you'll notice there that the content is not reflowing because I've got a fixed width on my container. So the first thing I'm going to do before I get into the media queries is change this to a max width. That means that the content is going to flow inside that page like that, which is much better. And then I'm just going to put just some padding of, let's try 2%. Padding 2% around it, just so it's just slightly away from the edges. In fact, let's increase that a little bit. Let's go 5%. That's better. So there we go. I've got what looks like, what's actually a liquid website at the minute because it resizes from the full width all the way down. It's a liquid website rather than a responsive website. So let's make it responsive. The first thing we want to do is put the two columns next to each other when we get to a particular size, let's say 700 pixels. So to do that, I'm going to set up a media query, and we'll do this in another section down here. I'll call this section responsive. And we want this to start from 700 pixels. So in here at 700 pixels on my container, I'm going to do display flex. And that's going to make my two elements go next to each other like that. As simple as that. From 700 pixels upwards now, you can see that the two divs are going next to each other. And that looks okay, but I think we need to put some padding around it just to make it look a little bit better. So I'm also at this point going to resize the content div and the sidebar div to have width of 45%. And then once we've done that, we just need to make it so there's space between the flex elements. So we're going to do space between, so the left hand element goes all the way to the left and the right hand element goes all the way to the right. So to do that, we just need to do justify content space between, and it goes to the other side like that. Although that space is a little bit too much, so we'll have it at 48%. So now there you can see from 0 it's a mobile website, and then as we go up to 700 pixels it becomes two divs that go next to each other. And now I think we need to add something a bit extra, so maybe at about 1000 pixels wide or something like that, we want to make it look like a traditional website. We want the content to be maybe 75% width, and then the sidebar to just shrink the width a little bit more. So that's the final thing we're going to do. So to do that, I'm going to come in here and add another min width to start at 1000 pixels wide. The only change I've got to make is just changing the widths of these two things. So I want the content to be about 65% width. And then I want the sidebar to be, let's try 20%. So now when I drag this up to 1000, that's probably a bit too thin, so let's just change that to 30%. And now when I drag the site up, you can see how the site is responding. It is changing its widths and it's changing its styles based on the min widths that I've put inside my content. And that's the basics, really. That's the basics to responsive web design. And there's not much else to it. There's just the examples of the min width and the max width. Although you saw when I just created that then, that we only really needed min width to make a fully responsive website. It's only when you start getting into more complicated stuff and more complex layouts that sometimes that you need bigger widths. I think from this tutorial, you should just start with the min widths, see where you get with those, and then start trying max widths, and then combining the two.